Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Tonight's dawn panel, today's students, tomorrow's leaders. We'll begin with an opening prayer by our host, Reverend Jonathan Shute of the Rolling Hills United Methodist Congregation.
Good evening. The moon is full tonight. Mindful that by the time of the next full moon, we will be headed toward Passover and Holy Week, and we will be in Ramadan, all of which are tied to the lunar calendar rather than the solar year. Our campus is full tonight. There is a choir practice. There are scouts meeting, and our panel is diverse and full as well, representing distinct traditions and a perspective on a season of life for which we are grateful. Let us pray. Loving God, you move through our lives in different times and different seasons, inviting us to discover your leading for our lives in various and interesting and ever-changing ways. For the opportunity to listen and learn about events that are happening in the lives of young adult members of our congregations and of our wider community, we give you thanks this night. Bless us with wisdom and compassion for each other and ourselves as we move through seasons of renewal and of hope. We pray in your holy name. Amen.
Thank you. Introducing tonight's panel, from your right, Rabbi Zach Zisman, Hillel Director and Jewish Student Advisor at LMU, Keenan Tywell, Muslim Student Advisor at LMU, Reverend Jean Rose Smith, Methodist Student Advisor at UCLA, and Father Mark Filano, Catholic Student Advisor at UCLA. I'm Bob Rothman. As we discuss college students today, it is vital to remember that there is no one-size-fits-all for any of the topics that we're going to consider, but we're trying to get at what I guess you would call a mean, an average, a typical, or something like that. So I'm saying this now so that as the panel speaks, they don't have to repeat it every time they speak, because the distribution is very wide in all of their students. Let's begin by considering the students we'll be discussing tonight. First, both LMU and UCLA are very strong academic universities, which biases, of course, their student population to be on the high side of academic standards. Secondly, the students our panelists work with have a religious background of some degree, and they have chosen to be part of their faith religious organization on campus. These two facts set them apart from many others, and it's important to remember that this is the group that we're talking about, the group that our panelists know best. Let me start. Let me start with that one point that I just made. How different are the students at your university who participate in religious life versus the ones who don't? Reverend Rose Smith, why don't you go first?
Thank you. It's an interesting question because I think as we look at the population with which I serve, it is very much a mixture of students. We see ourselves more of a spiritual collective because students come from many different Christian traditions, as well as we have Muslim students, we have Hindu students, we have students who are skeptical, who are challenging what they were brought up with, their worldview. And so I think what they come for is there's a sense of longing and a need to understand purpose and value and humanity. Why are they here? These big questions that they don't always find answers in an institutional setting or in the belief system that they were raised in. So they want to check that, challenge it, but also embrace it. And so I think it's really critical that we think more broadly, especially at a public university where there is not one specific understanding, but where they want to look into it, look deeper, but not in an academic way. They want to have conversation, they want to practice, and they want to engage with people with different belief systems so they can begin to test their truth and their understandings, and then sometimes figure out where do they fit in all of this.
Let me ask at LMU, either of you, do you feel that the students who participate in religious activities are very different from the others, given the fact you are at a Jesuit university, of course?
So first of all, Jonathan was right there. Thank you, Jonathan, for having us. It's great to be here again. I really appreciate it. I take issue, I think, first of all, with the premise of the question. I have found in my experience, the Jewish students that I meet don't necessarily come from a religious background or don't have any affiliation. Now, LMU is not necessarily the place where affiliated observant Jews are going to look to go to the Jesuit school. So that's definitely a caveat. But there certainly are. There certainly are students who are religious or come from a religious background. I think the biggest difference I see is more spiritual versus religious, whatever religious means, and I think we can unpack what that means. But a lot of the students that I connect with, even the ones who have a strong Jewish identity, even the ones who come from a background of Jewish day schools or Jewish youth programs, tend to be more spiritual than religious. So that I would say that's the biggest thing. I agree with a lot of what Jean was saying. They're looking more for connection and community.
Eden, you want to?
Thank you, Bob, for having us. I think what I see from a lot of the LMU students, from those who are religious, they're really engaging on a deeper level some of those questions of meaning and purpose, but through the lens of their faith traditions. I think that they want to understand, grow, and they want to deepen their faith, and they want to go beyond the faith that they inherited as children to a deeper understanding of it beyond a superficial understanding. At the same time, I think there is a curiosity about other faith traditions, and they do want to learn about other faith traditions through interfaith dialogue, kind of like what we're doing tonight. And that's an interesting space. So Rabbi Zach and I are very involved in interfaith dialogue on campus because it's in those spaces where you find the non-religious and the religious starting to interact with each other. All of them curious to learn, curious to understand from one another and to learn from one another. And like you said, there are a lot who are identifying as spiritual but not religious, but at the same time, they're invested in interfaith dialogue and curious about interfaith dialogue. And we have students that we work with who are identifying with multiple faith traditions at once. We work with one student who's identifying Christian and Taoist simultaneously. The teachings of the two traditions resonate with them. So in some ways, I think interfaith dialogue is interesting because in the university setting, it's a way to bypass the differences between religious versus non-religious because you're able to gather them all together to have those conversations about faith.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would think that the Muslim students would be their parents may be the first ones to come to this country, maybe the second generation at most. So they have a more conservative background and are still acclimating to life in this country. How do you see that?
I think the conservative traditional versus more liberal spectrum exists across our traditions. While that's certainly true, a lot of our students are coming from immigrant families, but I also work with a lot of students who are international students. So a big chunk of the Muslim students at Loyola Marymount, out of about 250 to 300, at least 100 of them are coming from Kuwait alone, and from a number of other Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar as well. And then we have a sizable number of American Muslims too, many of whom their parents are immigrants, some of whom their parents are African American who converted to Islam as well. So it's a diverse group at the end of the day. And I think that, like I said, conservative versus liberal, you find that among Catholics, among Muslims, among Jewish students, Protestant non-denominational students. It kind of exists everywhere.
Go ahead. It's interesting that I have been a campus minister at many different types of schools. I've been at public state universities, I've been at Catholic universities, private universities. And when I was at a Catholic campus, you have the crossroads there of culture and diversity. And as a campus minister or as the chaplain of the school, I had to think about all the populations. Whereas now when I'm at UCLA, a public university, our Catholic center is on the edge of campus, not part of the administration of the school. And it's the Catholic students who are motivated to find us. They're the ones that I deal with mostly. And so a little ironically, I'm more surrounded by Catholics every day than I would be if I were at the Catholic universities that I've been to in the past. One thing probably is similar to all of us too, is that I kind of image it as concentric circles with our most core students kind of like at the center. These are students who, they eat, drink, breathe, sleep, Catholic thought and scripture and tradition and that kind of thing. The devotional life, they want to see how it applies to their life. They see it as a lifestyle. And then maybe going out from there, you might have practicing Catholics who are committed, but at the same time, maybe not as conversant with the tradition. Keep going out farther, then you might have those who we might call nominal, but they identify. There's something there that resonates with them. They want to learn more. They want to be there. And I'm sure there are a lot of stages in between all of those and outside of those too. Those are just hanging on. But something I could say generally about those, because I experience all of them, is that very often they are what we've just heard. They're seeking community, they're seeking connections, especially at a place like UCLA, which is so large, so impersonal at times. They're all looking for places to connect. But here they're looking for a place to connect around beliefs and values, which isn't necessarily what the wider population of students who are looking to connect around interests. They want to be, the rock climbing group or whatever it is that shares their interest. But here we're on a different level. Here we're on a level of openness to spiritual resources, practices, prayer, meditation, these things that will be a resource, hopefully, for the rest of their lives when they are being confronted with the ups and downs of life, the stresses of life, things that will connect them to a richer place, a richer tradition. I also think there's definitely a kind of non-elitism in the students I see because, I think a lot of groups are very selective on campus. Anybody can join, but at the same time, you have to have a lot more in common. Whereas at our center, there's a lot of diversity, race, language, ethnicity, and you find kind of immediate acceptance. And I think that's a calling card for many of our students. They like that sense of I'm going to be in contact with people who are different than I am. And yet there's that unity amidst that diversity.
I think one thing that I hear in that, no matter who the student is and what their background is, engagement is always something that I'm looking to do. How can I engage this student in front of me? Most of the students that I meet don't wake up and I talked to this about at dinner, don't wake up and say, how can I pray like a Jew today? Or oh, I have to pray 3 times today. Or they're not even thinking, how can I eat as a Jew? I can't touch that bacon. That's not what's on their mind. It may be what's on, I would love to study Talmud and pray. I would love to do that all day. Not necessarily what college kids are doing. And so figuring out what's going to engage this 18-year-old who may be deeply Jewish. Don't say that they're not Jewish, because even though they don't, according to them, do anything Jewish, keep kosher, pray, whatever that may be, they're deeply proud to be. And so what can we do, what can I do to help figure out that engagement, whether it's going bowling or finding a text, what it is? That becomes a question.
Yeah, and I would just want to pop off that. It's helping them find ways to understand what they've believed, what others believe, but really making it real and authentic, to practice it in daily life, not just as a ritual that they have to go through because somebody told them to, but because it's meaningful, it has purpose, it grounds them, it gives them a sense of hope, it gives them a sense of well-being, it helps them go through this academic rigor that they go through, the challenges of being social on campuses where to say you're religious is people laugh at you or like, oh, okay, you're one of them, okay. But what is the real value of holding on to those things that are truly important to you as the core values of your belief and how you're pursuing that, your profession within your family, and sometimes challenging what your family's beliefs are that have maybe harmed you or kept you from really fully embracing your tradition and saying, but they told me this, but I see this. And it comes with second generation, with immigrant families. How are you living outside of the institutional teachings you were told were this is the only way to be Jewish, this is the only way to be a Muslim or a Christian, or a non-believer, you have to be harsh and ugly. How do we do that respectfully of ourselves and with our community? Because we want to belong somewhere. It's about belonging and finding that place where it's being enriched. And so it's like the rabbi said, how do we engage that when we have a really horrible day, when we have a really good day? Where do we find the possibilities of celebrating that without it being, look at me, I'm the best whatever, and I'm going to get my jewels in my crown when I go to heaven. It's just living a good life, and to do that with dignity and purpose.
How do they balance ritual versus spirituality, particularly as compared to their parents and their grandparents? How are they different and how are they alike the generations before in their religious observance? Anyone?
I can think of 3 things. First of all, I think probably different from a lot of their parents or grandparents, they don't know the tradition in terms of the language that has been familiar to us. We call it a catechetical deficit. And part of that might be on the church's side, not communicating in changing times as well. But part of it might be on their parents' side, maybe not taking advantage of some of the resources, catechetical resources. But I think I do find that maybe they don't know the tradition as well, which is one of our challenges now in campus ministry. How do we bring them up to speed as far as some of those things go? Another thing that I find a little challenging is that I would say some of our students mirror the polarization in American political landscape, the cultural landscape between the traditionalists and the progressives. I think in our own tradition, we've always kind of prided ourselves somehow in having a remarkable balance of unity and diversity. And yet now I see it's a little strained, a little bit more of that tension probably than their parents or grandparents experienced. The third thing I thought of was the stresses that they're dealing with now, and how some of those are similar, but some of those are different. I mean, developmentally, they're probably similar. But I was just reading something not long ago about a shift in around 2012, 2014 in terms of incidence of mental illness, depression, anxiety, mood disorders, addictions, things like that. And there's probably a number of factors, but when you think about 2014, one of the major factors is probably going to be social media that we don't know yet. We're in this transition phase. We don't know how it's affecting us yet. We know it's a problem, but we don't necessarily know all the avenues out. In fact, right now, while I'm here, some of our students back at my center are screening documentary from PBS last year. I think it was called The Social Dilemma. They're talking about it tonight. And yeah, I think that's an area of discussion, and that's something, that's a new stress that we haven't seen before.
I can unpack. I agree with everything you said. I think one thing that I see all the time that was surprising is just how much lack of cultural religious literacy students have. So most of the Jewish students that I meet know an incredibly little about Judaism. They probably at best have a 13-year-old view of education and probably more like an elementary understanding, never mind someone else's religion. So they know very little about their own and nearly nothing about others. So that's I think that's something I see over and over again. And certainly true in the Jewish world. I know for me, I tell this story all the time. I started work at LMU. People said, "Rabbi, you're the first rabbi I've ever met." And I said, "That's cool. You're the first Jesuit I've ever met." And I've started to interpret that it's not that I was the first Jew that I ever met. It wasn't that that person was the first Jesuit that I ever met. But what was very true was I knew nothing about the Jesuit faith, as I imagine they knew nothing about the Jewish faith. That's different than not knowing a Jew. That's, you don't know anything about Judaism. So I think that's something that we can really, really spend a lot more time doing, is just increasing literacy. I think social media, to also to your point, is just probably the number one thing that I see that has gotten in the way with ritual or a number of other things. I think a loss of trust. We can't not talk about a loss of trust. You know what? I'm 45, but my brother, who is 11 years younger than me, his whole life was defined by, I mean, I can go on and on and on, but 9/11, the economic downfall, on and on and on. So a lack of trust in institutional living, which what's the bowling for Robert Putnam talked about in the 70s or 80s, is just continue to deepen and deepen and deepen. So.
And I think ritual is really important to students, and our students go from 18 to 64, and I'm not kidding you, returning back to school. But ritual, not as something that is a rote, doing it just because you're doing it, but because it gives comfort. It gives a remembrance of something that they felt cared about, or that they knew when in times of stress they could go back to a prayer, to a song, to a blessing, and hold on to that and ground them. Because again, social media, some of the statistics that we're looking at say that over 52% of college students are on some kind of mental health regime, because they're so stressed and so anxious, given this fluctuation in the last probably 20 years of society increasing demands on them. They're coming with behavior addictions, with substance addictions. They're coming with all sorts of background that is heavy. Some of it's burdened through their faith tradition, some of it's through their cultural perception, who is on the in, who is on the out, who is politically correct, who is fitting the right image of who should be at this university. So they're juggling all these things along with rigorous academics. So ritual plays a big part. We talk a lot about what are the similarities between prayers, between the ways we bless each other, we bless our food, the way we share food, so that they can begin to see the common ground of breaking bread together that most faith traditions will do in some way to share that and then share their experience of that. So I think ritual is really important, but not one that's mandated and prescribed, and you must pray this way and this way and this way. I have Muslim students who come in and say, can I go and use the chapel or use a space to pray because it's prayer time? And we have prayer mats, they bring their own, they just go and do that. And nobody questions it because that's important to them. Good. And so that ritual is honored and seen as a positive, not as, oh, weird. It's expected. It's a norm that we set within the community. So I think they're open to seeing that expression, but they're also very concerned about asking permission first because they want to be sure the spaces they enter are safe to go and do these things or to ask these questions and to perform the rituals or the blessings and to share them together, even though you may not be from the same faith tradition. Sharing a blessing is something we can all do. And they do it in their language and in their way, and it works really well.
Well, you have to, oh, go ahead.
Just very quickly, ritual is interesting. I think for a lot of the Muslim students, especially if they're coming from abroad, they use the ritual, especially the 5 daily prayers, as a way of maintaining their Islamic identity, not losing that if they're living, 5, 6, 10,000 miles away from home. I think also the university setting becomes a place for them where they can go beyond the Sunday school level of understanding their faith and really start to explore it at a deeper level. And I'm also thinking about how it's sometimes the place where they're interacting with people of their same faith but different denominations. It's the first time a Sunni Muslim will meet a Shia Muslim, a first time a Catholic may meet an Orthodox Christian, a conservative Jewish person with an Orthodox Jewish or Reform, stuff like that. So I think it's interesting that they come into conversation there, even though they may have grown up being taught, well, this is the only version of Islam that's okay. So that's really interesting. If I think about, though, how they're different from their parents or their grandparents, a couple things. I think they're much more social justice oriented. They're much more aware of what's going on socially around the world because of social media, I think. They're more likely, I think, to challenge authority and to question authority, especially if they see an injustice out there, challenge the status quo in ways I think that the previous generations were just taught not to, taught that, this is the one way and you're going to follow this way and just accept it and you're not really going to challenge it. So I think students today are much more willing to challenge it. And that's interesting to see at LMU. LMU is a very mission-driven university as a Jesuit Catholic school. Part of our mission statement is the service of faith and the promotion of justice. And a lot of students, even if they're not particularly religious, they really identify with that mission statement. It really resonates with them deeply. It inspires them in their work. We have an incredible amount of students involved with service and volunteering on campus. We have a number of service groups and organizations on campus. We just had cohorts of students from our campus ministry office come back from service immersion trips. They went to Ecuador, they went to Jamaica, they went to Mexico, they went to the Navajo Nation in Arizona. Some of them are religious and very involved in our programs, some of them not so much, but still inspired by our mission. Which, at the end of the day is grounded in Catholicism, in the understanding of Catholicism through the Society of Jesus and Ignatian spirituality, which talks about things like finding God in all things. It inspires these students, even we've had faculty and staff attend, some are religious again, some not religious, to go and do something about it. So I think those are some of the ways that it plays out in different forms. But it's very interesting how the university brings all this out from the students.
How do you find the students today strike a balance between idealism and reality, practicality? Where where do they stand on this seesaw? Whoever wants it can have it.
I think it speaks to maybe some of the polarity that we were hearing about earlier. There's a lot of bubbles. People are, because they're on social media, or we could talk about the impact of COVID, but I think people tend to be in a bubble oftentimes. They tend to be they get source the source of news and information they get tend to be different than their neighbor oftentimes, and that can cause I think some big challenges, which I think can get in the way of how they think about the ideal.
And I think reality is something they are all too familiar with. The realities of daily needs of food, of housing, of transportation, affording education, figuring out what you're going to do if you have, is there a job, is there a place for me? So reality smacks them down almost every day. It is how do we help and encourage them to see the hope and the possibility beyond that the reality is here, but where is that sense of good? Where is that sense of kindness? How do we pursue that from whatever our perspective is together? And that's the thing. I think reality, they know it so well, and they're so well versed in it that it's almost like, is there anything beyond this? How do we nurture that through the different faith lenses, through the different beliefs of saying, but beyond this, what is love? What does that look like to you? What is compassion? And it's being evidenced, as Kinan was saying, through social justice. It's saying, but wait, if you're telling me from my belief system that this is what we should do, why is this happening? How do then I take that, share it with somebody of a different understanding, and still work towards a common goal of justice and liberation? And what does that look like if I'm a Christian and a Muslim and a Jew working together? How do we show that? Through our interaction, not saying you have to be like me to work towards basic food systems for all people, basic housing, capacity given to all, and no matter what their age or orientation or status is. How do we do that from our unique view, but do it together more kindly so that we can coexist without trying to exterminate someone else or someone else's culture or belief?
There's a famous quote that I'm not going to get right now from Robert Kennedy, who said, "The age needs the qualities of youth, which are passion and idealism and having that heart for your ideals." And at the same time, we're also in a world that is going to teach us that we need to activate that passion in a way that is also going to have to make a living and raise a family and do all those kinds of practical things. So on the one hand, we really want to stoke that passion in them and say, yes, we affirm that. You want to be radical, we affirm that, because that's energy to change and to grow. And at the same time, you have to learn how to sustain that over the long term. And that means, again, finding those spiritual resources or that community of support that's going to be there and help you return to that radical center when, at the same time, you have to actualize it in a real world with a lot of limitations, both on yourself and in the community. So I think it's one of those things that you learn theoretically, but life teaches you as well. How are you going to see the extraordinary in the ordinary? How are you going to actualize those passions in everyday life? That's one of the things they're going to be learning. But at the same time, keep those qualities of youth in you as well.
This college generation has, as opposed to certainly their grandparents and probably their parents, has grown up where everybody gets a trophy, everybody gets a blue ribbon certificate, everybody gets praise for doing whatever they do. And we hear stories continually about self-interest in the millennials. How real is that with your students?
Again, they get knocked down by reality. They come to institutions like LMU and UCLA, and they find out they're not the brightest bulb in the box. They find out they're not academically at the top of the list. They find out that it's arduous and difficult, and they get knocked down and down and down. And it's hard for them to get back up because they've been led to think this other, oh, everybody's perfect, everybody wins. So they need those spaces and that conversation of what does it mean to fail? How do we grow from failure? How do we make room for not being the best? And it may be a family story because you're the first to go from your family and it's everybody's money going in to get you there. You better do well. So that stress plays on them. And the expectation at these universities is such that that's all they're supposed to do. They're not supposed to round out the rest of their life and be a full person, but to be a brain and not a heart and a soul and a caring body. And so I think it's really critical that we think about, yes, it's okay to fail. And we should do that more with all of us. How many of you like to fail? It's just counter to who we are, but failure is how we learn to be better. And so when we work with students, what I was like, it's okay if it doesn't work out. What do we need to do to improve it? Not to say you were wrong or you were stupid and it didn't work out right, but what could make this better? How do we enhance this so that the next time we get a different result rather than trying to keep replicating, I've got to get this right, I've got to get this right. It's not just a math problem. And there are other ways of solving it, like the new math and all this, which confuses me to no end because I don't understand it. I know how to do math. But there's multiple ways to address a challenge. How do we make room for them to try it and fall down and get back up and have people saying, it's okay? We have created this monster ourselves by trying to make people feel better rather than affirming the attempt and the efforts given to learn. Learning isn't always A+. Some of us, I had a professor in my undergraduate study said, most of you are going to get C's because that's normal, that's the average. A few of you will get a B. Maybe one of you will get an A. And that was like, wait, what? I'm not going to get an A in this course because I'm smart? Like, no. Her expectation was normal is C. And we have altered that for our communities, for ourselves, and for our children. So we need to rethink, how are we shaping success? Oh, you didn't get into UCLA, you only got into a CSU? Huh. Well, you must not be that good. We send those messages in all kinds of ways. So I think it's part of our responsibility as the gathered community to reframe that and say, good, UCLA degrees don't mean you're going to get the best job or you're going to be a happy person. It means you competed at a certain level and got a certain thing. It doesn't mean you're going to be a solid, successful person.
While a lot of students today got that A for effort and grew up around that, but they also face a ton of challenges that their parents didn't face. And off the top of my head, let's start with college tuition. Their parents could afford college. They didn't have to take on hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt just to go to school and get a bachelor's degree. Many of them have to, unless they have opportunities like scholarships and whatnot, but they're taking on a ton of debt. Even after graduation, what do they have to go through to get a job? Some of these kids are volunteering as interns, working for free for hundreds and hundreds of hours just to be able to get that foot in the door. Their parents didn't have to do stuff like that. So that's a lot of, difficulty. And, I was thinking back as you were talking to my own experience applying to college and going through the application system and the SATs and whatnot. It's stressful. I mean, you're competing with your peers. Everyone is like, did you get in here? Did you get in there? At LMU, there's this joke sometimes. Unfortunately, we hear things like, well, people go to LMU if they didn't get into UCLA or USC. And it's like, it's not the place you're going to, it's more, what are you going to do with that degree? Are you going to use it for good? Are you going to put it into action? Are you going to leverage who you meet? Are you going to leverage your connections with your professors to get the career and the passion of your dreams or not? I think because of a lot of these challenges that they're facing, in my opinion, they tend to be more idealistic than grounded in reality because they're seeing a bunch of harsh realities around them that they are struggling with finding a way of dealing with it, confronting it, addressing it. And idealism comes in to help address that. We can have a better future if we do X, Y, or Z, and we can't kind of think outside of that tunnel vision. I think our role as campus ministers is to come in and to help guide them as they're balancing between idealism and reality. What does the tradition say? How can it inform it? How can we balance it in a healthy way? And if the idealism is starting to be toxic, especially from a theological point of view, we can step in and say, you know what, that's not really grounded in the scripture and in the tradition, and we can help intervene there.
Go ahead.
I read an article just recently that made me think about how to answer that question. Are the students more self-oriented today? And I come up with a yes and no, because no in the sense of something like Keenan said earlier, the interest they have in social issues, they care about sustainability, about the environment. To them, that's a critical issue. So I think that someone in the author of the article said the debate on climate change action is over. I mean, this generation knows something has to happen, something has to be done. Other issues, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, justice around gender issues, these are things that they feel are very, very important. At the same time, I mean, they might know that sustainability is important, but at the same time, again, when it comes to social media, when it comes to consumption, the internet buying experience for convenience, I see that happening in a very uncritical way sometimes. They're very interested in that uncritical kind of consumerism just for convenience. So I think it's a both and, which means, we're all human and we're going to learn from the past and have to make some of the same mistakes again, and continually to call ourselves to what our tradition calls to.
I hear in this conversation, there's a lot of assumptions about what our students are coming to the university with. What was their experience like before they got there? What religion, what socioeconomic class? Sometimes the experience are vastly different from one another, and then we sort of treat them like they're all the same. Now that's kind of not entirely true, but oftentimes we use the same language, we use the same methods and techniques for people who are vastly different. And I think a lot of this, what I'm hearing, speaks to, people didn't have the same experience that I had in Sherman Oaks, right? I'd like to think that they did, or it's easier to think that they did, but you take someone even as close as Boyle Heights, their childhood compared to my childhood in Sherman Oaks, vastly different assumptions, resources, tools. I'm assuming, I don't know, it could be exactly the same. But I think it speaks to, if our ultimate goal, what I hear you talking about so beautifully, is providing some sort of meaning and purpose, or maybe some cultural intelligence to deal with the fractured world that we are in right now, the fragile public square where people don't know how to talk to each other, right? If our goal is meaning and purpose and cultural intelligence, doesn't really matter where they're starting necessarily. It's what we do at that time when they're there.
Who do they respect in terms of public leadership? There's so much being said by so many people, some of which are true leaders, some of which think that because they can hit a baseball or sing a song, people want to hear their political opinion. There's such a range out there, and filtering through this it's not easy. Who do they respect? Who do they look up to in terms of national leadership? Or international?
I have a flippant answer, and then I'll listen to the more serious one. We had a speaker series this year, and I get input from students. Who do you want? We were talking about Israel. All the speakers were influencers or TikTok influencers who they look to for serious, in-depth conversations about Israel. So I wrote down a TikTok influencer, but I'm sure there's more to it.
I think I found that as well. When our students, when they talk about speakers, they go to podcasts, they go to YouTube channels. And unfortunately, I don't know if clickbait is involved in this or whatever, a lot of them tend to be, again, on that polarizing side of things, either on the traditional side or the progressive side. It's interesting, though, that in either case, whether religiously they want to be identified on one of those ends of the spectrum, that's not necessarily a predictor for the political side of the spectrum. For example, I think a lot of our more traditional students, they're just as involved or just as interested in environmental issues or economic justice for the poor, or how the immigrants are being treated, things like that you might associate more for the progressive side. And on the progressive side, they're very interested in what we would call the respect life issues or other kinds of issues that might be politically considered on the other end. And I think a lot of that overlap happens in our tradition because of the stance of Catholic social teaching, which is neither politically left or right. And so they find a lot of common ground there. So I think I find that interesting, that progressive traditional on the religious side doesn't necessarily translate on the American political spectrum at all.
I would agree with that. I think, the Islamic tradition transcends the left-right political spectrum of the modern day. So it doesn't really fit in neatly with either one side. There are things that the tradition will say that'll agree more on the left and things that it'll agree with more on the right. I think, though, on the topic of social media and TikTok, that's been one concern I've seen among Muslim students. They will find influencers who have a big following and they come across them on social media and they start to follow them and suddenly they become an authority on Islam and you don't even know what are their credentials, are they a legit scholar or not? Is this someone worthy of following or not? Who are their teachers? You don't really know any of these things. Sometimes it'll be an influencer who suddenly one day to the next decides to convert to Islam and suddenly they're a celebrity and they want to follow them and they're looking to them for religious guidance. And it's like, let's wait a minute here. This person doesn't have the most Islamic lifestyle. They've just come into the faith. Let's not elevate them to, a religious authority. So that's concerning. I think authentic leadership, especially in the religious realm, but I think it's very much needed. And I think sometimes when they're turning to social media, it's a reaction to the hypocrisy that they've seen at the higher levels. I don't see the younger generation looking today, for example, for, let's say, traditional Islamic scholarship from the Middle East. I think especially after the Arab Spring and how it played out, it was so ugly, it was so violent. People are compromised given their political affiliations. They've just kind of given up on that, and then here, Islam is still very much in its infancy phase. It is not as old as Catholics or the Jewish community in terms of building up its institutions. So a lot of them don't know where to turn. So I think that's where, in the university setting, if they seek out campus ministers, they seek out people who teach in theology, it's really important for them to go there to start to get that authentic scholarship.
I appreciate the statement that was made, and I forget who did it, but no matter how cynical I get, it's not enough. When I was young, if you lied publicly, your political career was over. Now there's no shame among our public figures. How do they treat this? They don't know the old way. This is what they live in today, and they've grown up with it. And where I can say it's terrible, this is probably normal to them. I don't know.
I think it has been normalized. And I think what it has led is to major distrust of leadership across all spectrums, political, religious, everything. academic because they don't trust that what they're hearing is not a line of something to entice them into something they don't particularly want to do. It is fracturing trust. It is disrupting their sense of well-being and their sense of belonging to something that's of value. And so I think we have to think about the more we uphold the consumerism, the glitz of the notoriety of an influencer, of someone saying, oh, I'm this, and now you follow me. They don't believe any of it. So it's really hard for them to go back to what do you really believe? And that's when it comes down to good theological scholarship is, this is who Jesus was. He was a Palestinian Jew who did this. And when you go back to the core foundations of the text, then they can see it, and because they are academic and really good at critical thinking and analysis, they can begin to pull apart text, sacred text, and say, oh wait, this is not what the institution taught me, this is not what the culture taught me, this is not what my mother taught me, this is what theology says, this is what the sacred writings say. They start to, oh, I can ask those questions, I can dig into it, and I don't have to let go of it and say, it's gone, it's just garbage. It's actually makes me think and understand better why I can be this tradition, because the core fundamental teachings are solid. It's all the human stuff we put around it that makes it go, I don't trust them because they're doing things they shouldn't be doing in accordance with these principles of their faith.
Father Villano, how do your students face the reality that ethics is just not publicly seen? It's hard to find anymore, but it's the world that they grew up in. How do they deal with that?
Sometimes I ask them to, or sometimes I say, well, don't normalize what you're seeing now. It hasn't always been that way. And where would you like it to be? And that's part of their conversations. And I think they're having those conversations. There are a lot of challenges that they have right now. I think of, some of the things that politically are very active are challenging them, but what's happening in our faiths is challenging them too. I find that they're very open to discussion of these things and applying the tradition. I mean, when you think about how misinformation has been weaponized, for example, in our society, and what our tradition says about lying, it's as simple as that sometimes. And I think they see it. So I'm actually a little bit more optimistic on that level.
That would be good.
A lot of, I think a lot, I spoke of literacy, and somewhere along the line, I think I learned critical thinking skills, or at least enough of the tools to increase my critical thinking skills. And it's really hard sometimes to interpret or define what's real, what's not, what's ethical, what's not, when you're not taught, right? So I think that's a piece of it. It's not necessarily being taught anymore. You're seeing it more on this politician, that politician. And then, with again, social media, all these things, it's new, but deep fakes, all these things that take a lot of cultural and social and intelligences to sort of determine what's real, what's not, what's balanced, what's measured. That's a hard skill to develop. And when everything is so politicized, so black and white, so this or that, it's a hard, I see real challenge in students trying to, navigate a really rough terrain out there.
I'm sure it is very hard. You just don't see people being punished or showing shame for terrible behavior. It happens all the time, and there's no price to be paid for it. In the old days, if somebody committed a crime, the movie code said he's got to be punished. Can't get away with it. Now,
I think for a lot of the students, they look at it that, we didn't create this system, we inherited it. if lying and cheating and misrepresenting, as we sometimes see in Washington and things like that, if that's been normalized, well, we're not in the halls of Congress. We didn't allow things like that to happen. We were not part of the leadership that allowed that to happen. So then it's more of, what do we do with this situation? How do we deal with it? For a lot of them, I think they're disillusioned and they start to wonder, is it worth getting involved? Is it worth being active and being a proactive citizen who's deeply concerned about these things? Or is the system so fundamentally broken that we kind of throw our hands up and give up? And I think that's where it becomes an opportunity for them to turn back to their tradition and to their faith, and to find those things that can inspire them to keep going. I'm reminded of a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who said, if you see something wrong in your society, then you should change it with your hand. If you can't change it with your hand, change it with your tongue. And if you can't even say something about it, then at least wish it away in your heart. And the Quran has a lot of verses that talk about not blindly accepting what your community, your society does by saying that, well, we found our forefathers, our ancestors, our grandfathers, our parents doing this, and so we followed and we did the same exact thing. And of course, here it's in reference to paganism, but I think there's a parallel here to the social ills that we see. Do we blindly accept it? Do we accept the loss of ethics in the public discourse, the lying and the cheating? Or do we say to ourselves, our faith tells us we need to do something about this. How can we do something about it? What can we do? How can we get involved so that we don't lose hope?
Do the students look to say, when it's my turn and when I have the more authority, I will fix this, I will make it right? Or do they tend to withdraw from the arena because it stinks?
I don't think they withdraw. I mean, I've seen students advocating at Loyola for better wages for our dining workers and our facilities workers. And I mean, they're marching into the president's office at the university campus, and they're advocating, and it's because they're committed, like I said, to our mission, the service of faith and the promotion of justice. So I don't think that they give up. I think at the local level, if we go outside of the university for a second, I think our local parishes, congregations, mosques, temples, they can do a lot more to empower youth and to really give them an opportunity to take the lead on the leadership within those congregations, to be more involved, to have a louder voice. And very often I feel that, at least from what I see in the Muslim community, is not happening as much as I would like it to be.
I also see a lot of conversation happening about the system itself. It's not like these elders who are making mistakes grew it. They were young too once who were idolized and live in utopia, and there they went being human again and made a mistake, right? So there's something about that. It's not like a lot of them I think withdraw. A lot of them I think are, I'm going to do better, or I'm going to change it. But I hear a lot of talk about, well, what is it about this system that's allowing this to happen or inviting them to happen? So that's something that I see that maybe our parents also talked about, but I see that.
Yeah, and I think that it's the systemic challenge that I see students very engaged, and I don't think they're waiting to be leaders. They are leading. They are pushing those of us who are trying to listen, and churches, mosques, everyone to say, pay attention, because this is the reality they're facing. They're facing a climate crisis where sustainability, they may never see grandchildren, where life on earth for them will be vastly different than ours. So they're up, they're ready, they're talking about it. Some of them are on the front line. Some are working on how are the policies we can do, how do we get the professional credentials to get in there and do this and advocate in that way? How do we dismantle the system that has been set against us so that we can reframe it and build it into a different way of being? And I would say they're looking more for a beloved community where everyone has the chance to engage to their capacity, where we respect the difference, but we work towards a future together that's sustainable for all people, all of creation, where they're not just sitting back saying, well, when I'm empowered, this is what I'm going to do, because they already know they have power, they have agency, and they have a passion because they see a short light ahead of them where they may get blindsided, and they're trying to fix this. So when we say, well, when you get a little older, when you come back to the congregation and start doing the real work of an adult, okay, we've minimized their passion and their understanding and their talent, and that puts them into this hierarchy. So they're looking more of a horizontal leadership where they can engage now, where they may not have the theological degree, but they have the theological chops to ask the questions that need to be asked of all the systems, and to push it into a place where we are now paying attention and not just waiting for them to grow up and become a nice member of the group and do what we think they're going to do. Those who are disillusioned will warm up to an idea of a group or a community that embraces their interest, their capacity, where they have authority. They already have authority because they're learning things I never learned, and they're challenging the systems that are set against them. When they go and speak to, we had the Disabled Student Union take over the chancellor's office for 2.5 weeks. And they held that fort down for quite a while. And it was known through some of the administration, well, if we just wait it out, they'll give up. Because, these are the Disabled Student Union. They don't have the capacity to do this. 2.5 weeks later, they're like, now what do we do? Because they couldn't figure out how to get them out of the building because they were so organized and so passionate about speaking up for their needs and their access. And we pretended, well, we just wait it out. They'll go away. And they didn't. And they affected change because they stuck to their focus. They engaged a coalition of other groups who were not necessarily identified as disabled students, but who understood the urgency of having their voices heard and the visibility of them on campus acknowledged from the administration. And they got to some talks that they may never have gotten to if they hadn't said, no, this is important. They led the university into a conversation. The same with the graduate student strike at the UC system. It was huge. And it didn't have the full effect they hoped for, but they stood strong for about 10 weeks. And they kept thinking, well, if we just wait a little longer, the money's going to run out and they're going to not, they're going to give up. And some did because they couldn't financially afford, but many said, nope, we are here for the long haul. We're not going to walk away from this because it's not just about me.
There's a word that I hear over and over again today that was never in our vocabulary when I was a college student. The word is stress. The students, they seem to always be talking about the stress that they're under. We just did what we could do. I mean, I think that it looks to me like they think too much about it. Am I wrong? What do you counsel when they come to you and say, Father Lano, I'm under a lot of stress. I can't deal with this stuff. Or I'm sure you get a lot of those calls.
Yeah, and we want to be a community for them in that. We want to provide them with what a community does for people under stress, which is to listen, to counsel, and to let them know that they're not alone in that. And I think all of our spiritual traditions do that very well for one another. But that brings up the whole idea of what is our community there for them at this stage of life. And this is a developmental kind of challenge for them. They're coming from high school. The developmental challenge there was group identity, who do I belong to? But now it's, what's my self-identity going to be? I'm rubbing up against all of these changes, all of these different ways of looking at things. How is that going to expand my view, but also help me understand where I am rooted? And so as a community, we're modeling something for them. We're modeling what adulthood looks like. Sometimes I have to tell the students, welcome to adulthood. When you have these questions, when things aren't as easy as they used to be. but you're not alone in looking at that. There was a theorist, I think she was a social scientist of some ilk, Sharon Parks, I think her name was. She wrote a book called The Critical Years, which talked about how young adulthood has its own challenges. Before that, people kind of talked about adolescence and adulthood, but people weren't really looking at the developmental challenges of young adulthood, that needing to imagine a new way of being myself and know where I'm rooted, but also how I'm different from those around us. How do we provide that kind of community that allows them to imagine, but also is a safe place for them to do that developmental work?
I would just add that, I think communities look different. They look differently now from community to community. They look different. Sherman Oaks now looks much different than it did in the 90s when I was going to school, in the 50s when my parents were going to school there. So that's one piece. Communities are different. They look differently. They have different resources, and that I think that adds to stresses, and we can unpack that. But I think that's part of it. Again, I think of school shootings. I think of financial situation now. I think of, it was a given that my parents were going to buy a house. The fact that my wife and I were able to buy a house in our 40s is a miracle. Most COVID, we could spend weeks and weeks and weeks talking about the stresses that COVID brought to people. Social media, again, when a pretty healthy person like me is looking at a screen for 4, 5, 6, 7 hours at a time, maybe 8 or 9 on the weekend, I feel more stressed at times. I think it's real. And yeah, of course, we want to create a place where when they leave us, maybe they know how to deal with that stress a little bit differently. It's not going to go away, but maybe they're in a position to better address it.
I think we should also remember that access to mental health services is pretty new. This generation, Gen Z, if we want to call them that, they have much more access to it than their parents or grandparents ever did. Their grandparents probably never had access when they were growing up. And if I think about what those generations went through between World War II, Vietnam, the word suppression comes to mind in terms of whatever trauma they may have had. So I'm sure that they dealt with stress too, but they just didn't talk about it and, stiff upper lip and kind of keep...
Exactly.
Yeah, keep calm and carry on, But that doesn't mean that stress went away. It just was bottled up and, went somewhere deep.
You felt you had to you had to take care of your problems.
Yeah, but maybe there was also no outlet, to take care of it. So you just kind of swallowed it.
Yeah, now
and
there
dealt
are
with it.
alternatives now, yes.
I think also what I see, at least with Muslim students, is there's been an unfortunate taboo around mental health and seeking out mental health services. There are some students who've really gone through some deep trauma in their families, some abuse. They need to have a way to work through that, and mental health services is a way to work through that. The worst thing an imam can do if they go to the local mosque, whether here or abroad, is to say, well, you're depressed, that just means you have low faith. Your faith is weak right now. That's like the worst thing you can do. So it's undoing stuff like that does serious harm to their faith and their spirituality when that doesn't need to be the case. Their faith can inform their mental health. We're supposed to take care of our bodies. That means also taking care of the mind that God gave us. If we're neglecting it, that's sinful. We shouldn't be doing that. It's a trust that God gave us that we should take care of. And so we should encourage them to seek out that help when they need it.
And I would just add that when I talk to students who are stressed, I like to talk to me about what the stress is. Is it distress? Is it something that's really causing you pain and anxiety and harm? Or is it stress that's forcing you to think deeper, to work harder, to meet the challenge? Because life is stress. When you're born, the first thing that happens is stress, and then you live. So is it distress? Is it disease or ease? Dis-ease or ease? Let's break it down into seeing what is it that's causing this. Where is the distress coming from that we can address together so that you begin to understand it's not just everything set against me, but maybe this is a challenge that you can turn into the opportunity to say, okay, I can do this because now I can go talk to my friend and get help with stats. And I can go here and get food, and I can exercise, and taking care of this gift, this vessel that God gave us in a way that's not just our body, but our mind and our spirit, so that we can work better to address the stress of life.
I would also add, sorry, Bob, I would be remiss on the eve of Purim not to mention anti-Semitism, which goes to an earlier question. That is unfortunately something, the first time in my life, that something college students are dealing with, that their parents and maybe grandparents are dealing with in a way that I've never in my 45 years have. So that's an added real stress, even in Los Angeles, that many of our students are dealing with in a way that I've never seen. Again, I've never seen. And I think, I'm sure my colleague Keenan can speak to.
I want to follow up on that. We see a lot of stuff in the newspapers and the media about friction between Muslim and Jewish students at UCLA. We never see it at LMU. One never knows whether the reporter was looking for a story that day and found 4 people that were fighting and arguing, or whether there was really something going on. But you would never see friction, never read about friction like that at LMU. Why? What's the difference?
I know you have thoughts on it. I have very brief thoughts. One, they're very, very different schools. UCLA is a beast, 30, 40, 50,000 students. LMU is 9,000. So on a very, very basic level, you're seeing the same people over and over again on one campus. On the other campus, you maybe never see people. There's more opportunities for relationship building, I think, at LMU, perhaps. The fact that LMU is a religious institution that is mission-based, a lot of service and faith-based students, I think also creates an atmosphere of more, I don't know what the right word is, protection. But I think those two are the big reasons that I see.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there. It's at the public university. There is, at least in my experience at UCLA, we don't want to talk about anything that's religious. We want to talk about the political divides. Okay, that's fine. We don't want to look at the conversations that need to happen from the religious traditions. We want to say we're just going to police both communities and keep them apart so that there's no chance of having any kind of conversation or dialogue, which has happened in the past, but it's not well received at the university. Between Hillel and the MSA, there's been conversations and sharing of food and discussion, but the university doesn't want to get behind it because then we're supporting religion. No, we're supporting an educational process of learning what that looks like and demystifying and trying to create a bridge. So there's a hesitancy to address it as religious or anything like that because now we're doing something we're not supposed to do as a university. When the University Religious Conference has stepped in, and when I was president, we had some issues with Students for Justice in Palestine and some Israeli conversations, sent letters to the chancellor saying, here we are as religious professionals, educators, we want to help with this. And the response came 8 months later through an associate vice chancellor. They don't want to talk about it because we don't want it to blow up. So we do get these pinpoints. Somebody comes in and something egregious happens. A Muslim woman's hijab is pulled off. But it wasn't a UCLA student, so it doesn't count. Huh? I mean, these kinds of things that we don't want to talk about because we don't want it to get out in the public, and then it gets out and becomes a big thing. And the students are like, who do we talk to? Who listens to us? The administration is quiet on some things, tone deaf on others, and unwilling to engage, and this goes for churches too, with the real questions that are at hand, because we're afraid of the repercussions. And the students get that, and they're like, why bother? I'm not going to enter into this. And so they keep a very low profile of what their religious belief is, because they don't want to be identified on either set of extremes.
I think at UCLA, interfaith programming is underdeveloped, even though we have a religious conference that supports and helps to fund events. Maybe we need to do more in terms of the campus ministries having some kind of common effort around that. But I do distinguish that from what I've seen at other, not just religious schools, but other private secular schools. I was at Yale for 4 years, and there was a university chaplain who was very conscious of the interfaith community and having events. I remember having events that were study events, interfaith panels like this, composed of students who would have a particular theme that they would share from their own tradition, and whether it's the scriptures or the theology from their tradition on a particular theme, like what does your tradition teach about death, or what does your tradition teach about prayer, or whatever it was. And they would share from their own traditions, and it was always surprising. Some people saying, I didn't think the Christian tradition would agree with ours on this, but now I see we do. I mean, this is the opportunity we have to maybe build some bridges that aren't being built right now.
I'll expand on that a little bit. I agree with what's been said. I think LMU and UCLA are vastly different schools. I mean, on the surface level, Rabbi Zach and I, we work for Loyola Marymount University. We're on staff. It's not like there's a congregation in Southern California that is sending us to serve as chaplains at the university, as in the case with UCLA. So that's also very different. We have an integrated multi-faith campus ministry office on campus at Loyola Marymount University, technically under the president's office, under the vice president for mission and ministry at the university that the school funds. And one of our programs is an Interfaith Council of Students, similar to what you were discussing, Father Mark. We have students from all our faith traditions, students that work with Rabbi Zach, work with me, work with our Catholic colleagues, our Protestant colleagues, Hindu students, and others. And we gather together, we come together with them once a month to talk about matters of faith, to share from their different faith traditions, to learn from one another, to better understand each other, to promote pluralism and interfaith dialogue. And we have other faculty and staff members from across the campus who are also committed to this interfaith dialogue that are involved. So I think in that sense, a private religious school has an advantage in promoting interfaith dialogue, and that leads to less tension because we're already dialoguing with one another. We can work through our differences in a healthy way that does not have to be confrontational.
What kind of careers do today's college students want to head for? What do you see? Are they different from previous generations in what they want to do? Certainly, there's more female empowerment than there was a generation ago. That's become fact and law. But what kind of careers do you hear your students look to?
I'll go very quickly. I think in general, this is a common theme in the Muslim community. Families will value the sciences. So I still see quite a bit of that. A lot of them are going into the sciences, especially engineering, some of them on the pre-med track as well. A good number in business too. Increasingly, I'm seeing business more and more. Less so in the humanities. I think there's a decline in the humanities, more the sciences, computer science, engineering, business, but the humanities is sort of on the back burner, I would say. And that's been my experience across the board.
But some people are not going to go into the computer science. They'll say, no, I can't do that. Where do they go?
I would see them, a lot of them in political science, let's say, because they're driven to be involved in politics. If they're going to go into the humanities, a lot of them go there. But yeah, they're a minority in general.
I think you're right on. There's been such an emphasis even in early public education for STEM. But arts, education, things are not as highly valued. They're not as interesting. They're not as productive in terms of material funding. So many of the students feel pushed in that way, and then they find out, wait, I want to be in ethnic studies. I want to be a community college professor, which is not notoriety of getting a big fancy name with a big UCLA degree, making big money. And so they come with one idea of this is where my family wants me because this means success. This means I'm going to be established. It means I can change the trajectory of this family and get out of poverty. And then they become opened up to other things of social justice, public policy, public affairs, art education, the things that make life livable. And they're like, but where's the degree going to take me? And they're looking at more entrepreneurial careers, not-for-profit, that is not a institution, not-for-profit that makes, $700,000-$800,000 for a director, but somebody who's doing community work, community-based organizations, maximizing their cultural capital wealth rather than just their academic chops. And so they're thinking more broadly, but they're still pressured into these degrees that you get a bachelor's degree, but now you need the master's and the doctorate to really go somewhere. And so it becomes a financial burden and misrepresentation of what's best for them in terms of fulfilling their God-given gift and call to create change and harmony in the world. And they struggle with that because they want justice. They want a community that exceeds what they're having, where there's sustainability, where there's common goals of care and compassion, and yet that's not being held up. Well, if you get this UCLA degree, you're going to get, if you go to law school, you'll get $124,000 a year at your opening job, and that is an enticement like none other. So it's helping them understand a good life doesn't mean you have to make buku bucks, because if you're not living your truth and communicating your realities in ways that change systems, maybe they're going to burn out, or they get into, again, the mental health issues that they're struggling with because it's not making them happy, but it's to conform to family pressure or to conform to societal expectations that, oh, you're an international student from India, you must be in engineering or computer science. You're not here for the art degree, because that's not something you would do, nor would you pay the ridiculous amounts of money it is for a master's degree.
Anybody
Well,
else?
just piggyback, I say we see the same thing at UCLA, mostly science, mostly STEM kind of careers, pre-law, pre-med too. But I do find a lot of our students looking for their elective courses in those things that are very different, like the humanities, like philosophy, like art. And I think it's because they themselves know that, okay, I'm here so I'll be able to make a living, but I also want to have a life. And so in other schools, and I'm sure LMU has a core curriculum that is more inclusive of that, UCLA probably doesn't have that, but they do have electives, and the students do search out the humanities in that way.
Questions? A lot of things to ask them, a lot of people to ask of.
Thank you. In the event of an anti-Semitic or anti-Muslim event that happens in the United States, you find the Jewish or the Muslim students, withdraw in themselves, or come more to you guys to be part of the community? And do you find that students of other religions come to be supportive or just ignore it?
Yeah, it depends on the incident, on the context. Generally, I find that students are so, I don't know what the right word is, busy, maybe involved in other things. Oftentimes they don't come. If it's something big, I'll get a student to, hey, Rabbi, did you hear about this? What can we do? I will say that there is, if God forbid there's something really big, we've done a lot of vigils together where we've come together and honored, a tragedy in the Muslim world or in the Jewish world. So.
I would agree. I mean, the whole campus community comes together from every faith tradition to stand in solidarity and in prayer. I recall, I believe in 2019 on the East Coast, there was an awful synagogue shooting. There was a shooting at a mosque in New Zealand in 2019. Those were some big vigils that we had on campus, and students from all different backgrounds were coming together. There is a silver lining in that tragedy that the community does come together. But we also want to put a focus on campus that let's not just gather in times of tragedy, let's also try to gather in times of joy. We've started to do more interfaith prayers for students as they're getting ready for final exams and having that kind of spiritual moment to take a breather and to pray before they begin their exams. So trying to balance not just to gather in tragedy, but also in joy.
All right. Go ahead. Somebody's quiet, where? Oh, maybe in the middle. Over here.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I appreciate your presentation. I graduated from Loyola when it was called Loyola in 1967, and we were talking about stress, and we had a feeling that if you voted for Barry Goldwater, if you voted for Lyndon Johnson, you still got a bullet in Vietnam. And we were under terrific stress. We had to take student tests to avoid the draft. And for many of us, it didn't work. But I remember to this day, one of my fondest, or not fondest, but most brutal memories was walking across the campus at noon when John Kennedy died. And the question is, I have a feeling that democracy is failing us, that we're challenging votes, and the same stresses that I feel today were there in 1967, and that the feeling that I have is that the quality of an education is that an educated person can deal with a disintegrating society regardless of what happens, and I want to know what your feeling is about democracy and education.
Oftentimes I feel like I grew up at a time when I feel like I was encouraged to celebrate similarities with people that were different than me, whether it was my religion, or maybe similarities in our food or some of our rituals, and that's a good thing. I've found that the space in our differences keep us away from each other. So for example, even something like God, there's a real challenge in the language that we use or the concepts that we think about that can get in the way of people getting along. So for me, a lot of it comes down to deepen literacy, more opportunities to practice with someone who's different than you, to engage with someone who is different than you is not a bad thing, but people lack practice or experience in that realm, and it's hard to navigate. And so I think that that's something that I noticed.
You know, I'm reminded of a saying that history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it rhymes. And, you know, I think we can draw certainly a lot of parallels to the 60s and our recent years and what we've been through. And, you know, I'm sure, as you mentioned, there was a lot of stress and dread in the 60s about where are we going with Vietnam and everything. But we came through that, and we came out through the other side. And, you know, if we feel that democracy is under threat today, I think we will come through it through God's grace and through the passion and the energy of our younger generations, informed by the wisdom of their elder generations. I'm reminded of, I was still a student at Loyola when Trump got elected in 2016. There was a lot of pain, there was a lot of upset, but the student community came together, and we had this massive meeting in a hall, you know, about the size of this prayer hall. 300 plus students. Rabbi Zach, you were there, I was there, a bunch of other people were there. And literally every student community from every faith background, every ethnic background came together just to be in community, that we're here for each other despite the stress that you're feeling, and we will support you. And for about a year after that, you know, different students from different groups were attending the meetings of other students from other ethnic clubs, other religious clubs, just to be in solidarity and to show that we're here for you, we support you, and we're in this together. You know, it's memories like that. That's a very fond memory for me, that in spite of the great stress that people were feeling in the wake of that election, the community really came together in a very powerful way. So there are always opportunities that I think that we can harness for our younger generations, and they have that passion. So I'm still optimistic about it.
9/11 was a very strong example of what you just mentioned.
True.
I would just add to that too, the whole environment in higher education is supposed to be a community that models the ability to think critically, but also a place where there is academic freedom. In other words, an environment where there can be civil discourse among those who have opposing views. And, you know, higher ed is being attacked right now from a lot of different angles. But I see it in that light, that it is a place where students are learning how to communicate passionately, but also respectfully. That's what it's supposed to be, where people aren't canceled, but there are boundaries which come from a code of ethics that make us a community. So I think that's a challenge, but I think that's a good school for democracy.
Yeah, and I think, yes, it's definitely under question. I think as students are struggling to understand the dignity of indifference, not indifference, that they can begin to see the human capacities in each other and learn, and again, it's the solidarity of the struggle of how do we create this community of education and learning civil discourse rather than screaming and yelling in each other's face. I've watched and worked with student orgs who are very politically, you know, at each other's throats, learning how to de-escalate, how to have these conversations now, so that for me, as you said, Kina, that there is hope that this community, these somewhat younger people, are learning the skills to bring this outside of the academy and into the world, where they can begin to have public discourse around difference with dignity, with respect, and with knowledge of what the others are believing and where they can build commonality, but where they choose to say, no, we differ here, but that does not mean I need to annihilate you and wipe you off the face of this earth.
Thank you all for coming. I'm sorry, you want to go ahead, say something?
Just one last thing. I think to piggyback on that, our faith traditions have a lot to say about human dignity. And that can provide us with a framework for dialogue despite difference, and to overcome that difference, that we can at least understand each other, maintain that basic respect, because our traditions, we can all agree, say that we're created in the image and likeness of God. So I think we can tap in on those sources and build upon that for greater dialogue.
Thank you all for coming, and let's have some interfaith cookies now.